There's a moment in your life, maybe one, maybe two if you're unlucky, where you do something so stupid, so genuinely, cosmically stupid, that the universe decides to respond personally. For Corporal Denny Marsh, that moment came on a Tuesday. Not a dramatic Tuesday. Not a Tuesday with storms or omens or anything worth putting in a history book. Just a regular, slightly overcast Tuesday on the excavation plateau of Voron 9, somewhere in the outer arm of the galaxy that humans had barely started poking around in, with red dust in the air and the distant hum of survey drones making everything feel like background noise in a dream you can't quite wake up from. Denny was 26 years old. He had a gap between his front teeth. He laughed too loud at his own jokes. He carried a battered field harmonica in his left breast pocket, even though he played it badly. And he had a habit of doing things, small, dumb, impulsive things, just to see what would happen. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Serafina Ochoa, had described him in his last performance review as functionally brave and aggressively unserious, which Denny had taken as a compliment and taped to his bunk wall. He was not a bad soldier. He was not a reckless one in the ways that got people killed. He was just Denny. And on that Tuesday, Denny Marsh kissed a statue. Not a human statue, not some kind of art installation that the crew had dragged up from Earth or printed out in the fabrication bay. This was an alien statue, ancient, pre-contact, pre-everything, if the archaeologists were right about the dating, which put the thing at somewhere between 40,000 and 400,000 years old, a number so stupidly large that it had stopped meaning anything to anyone who said it out loud. The statue was 9 feet tall. It was made of something that wasn't quite stone, more like compressed memory, the xenogeologists said, which was their way of admitting they had no idea what it was made of. It had a face. A humanoid face almost, which was what had made the whole excavation such a big deal in the first place. 2 eyes, set wide. A mouth that curved slightly downward, not into a frown exactly, more like the expression someone makes when they know something you don't. Long, articulated fingers folded across its chest. Faint patterns etched into its surface that the linguistics team had been arguing about for 3 weeks and hadn't agreed on anything yet. It had been standing here for longer than human civilization had existed, longer than the pyramids, longer than fire, arguably, just standing here in the open, on this plateau on a moon that no one had visited until about 4 months ago, waiting. For what, nobody knew. That was the thing about the statue. It had weight, real weight. You walked past it and you felt something in your chest shift slightly, like a note played just below the range of human hearing. The archaeologists felt it. The soldiers felt it. The survey drones apparently registered some kind of low-frequency resonance that no one could explain, and everyone was quietly unnerved by. Everyone was very careful around the statue. Everyone except Denny. Here's what happened, and I'm telling you this the way I saw it, because I was standing maybe 15 feet away when it all went down. We just finished the morning sweep of the outer perimeter. 3rd Squad, 4 of us, me, Denny, Private Kowalski, and Specialist Tran. We were coming back through the central excavation site, boots kicking up little clouds of red dust, and we passed the statue the way we always did, kind of giving it a wide berth without explicitly admitting we were doing that. Except Denny stopped. He stopped, looked up at the statue's face and said, "And I will never forget this for as long as I live," he said. "You know what, you're kind of pretty." Kowalski told him to knock it off. Tran kept walking. I stopped because I had a very specific feeling that something was about to happen, the way you sometimes just know. Denny grinned that gap-toothed grin of his, looked back at us and said, "You think she'd go out with me?" He was already stepping forward when he said it, already leaning in, already doing the thing that part of his brain should have stopped him from doing but didn't, because that part of Denny Marsh's brain had apparently taken the day off. He kissed it. He actually kissed it, put his hands on either side of its ancient, alien face, pressed his lips against its stone mouth, and made a little kissing sound that echoed slightly in the open air of the plateau. Kowalski said, "Oh my God." Tran turned around and said, "Denny, what the?" And then the statue opened its eyes. I need to be careful here about how I describe the next few seconds, because I've told this story a lot of times, and I've learned that if I go too fast, people don't feel it the right way. The eyes didn't just open, they illuminated, from the inside, a pale blue-white light like bioluminescence but colder, like starlight trapped inside rock. The eyelids, which we hadn't even known were eyelids, which we'd thought were just decorative ridges pulled back, and underneath them were these two flat, luminous surfaces that weren't really eyes the way we think of eyes, but functioned like them, tracking, focusing. On Denny. Denny, who still had his hands on its face. Denny, whose kiss had triggered a 40,000 to 400,000-year-old alien mechanism that we were absolutely not prepared for. He stepped back so fast he nearly fell over me. I caught him by the collar. His face, I've never seen Denny Marsh look scared. Not once in 8 months of knowing him. But in that moment his eyes were wide and his jaw was doing this slow drop thing, and he said, very quietly, in a voice completely unlike his usual voice, "Huh." That was it, just huh. The statue moved. Not fast, not violent. Slow, deliberate, the way old things move when they've been still for a very long time. A sound like a mountain thinking, like tectonic plates having a conversation. The fingers, those long, articulated fingers, uncrossed from its chest, and it raised one hand, and the light in its eyes brightened, and somewhere in the excavation site an alarm started going off. Within 4 minutes, the entire camp was awake. Within 7 minutes, Lieutenant Ochoa was on scene, standing in front of the now-animated ancient alien statue with her hands on her hips and a very specific expression on her face, the expression she only made when Denny was involved. She looked at the statue. She looked at Denny. She looked at me. "Marsh," she said. "Ma'am, did you kiss the statue?" Denny opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Define kiss. "Marsh." "Yes, ma'am." She closed her eyes for about 3 seconds. Then she opened them again and looked at the statue, which was still moving, slowly raising that hand, those ancient fingers spreading open, the light from its eyes casting long shadows across the excavation plateau. "All right," Serafina Ochoa said, and I have never loved her more than in that moment. "Let's figure out what we've woken up." Chapter 2. What slept beneath the dust. The thing that nobody in the xenoarchaeology briefings had adequately prepared us for, and I've gone back over those briefings, all of them, many times in the months since, was the possibility that the statue wasn't a statue. They'd called it that from day one: statue, artifact, monument. The language of something made, something passive, something that existed as a record of something else rather than as a thing in its own right. But the statue wasn't a record. The statue was a door. Or more accurately, the statue was the thing that stood in front of the door, the guard, the key, the test. We didn't know any of that yet, standing in the red dust of Voron 9 Plateau at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning, watching it move. We just knew that it was moving, that it was looking at Denny, and that every instrument the survey team had on site was now screaming at full volume. Dr. Yumiko Adebio was the head xenoarchaeologist. She arrived on scene about 4 minutes after Ochoa, slightly out of breath, her tablet clutched to her chest, and she stood and watched the statue for a long moment with an expression I can only describe as someone witnessing their entire career reshaping itself in real time. "It's been waiting," she said, to no one in particular. "Waiting for what?" Tran asked. She didn't answer. She was already walking toward it, tablet raised, scanning. The light in the statue's eyes tracked her movement. She stopped. It stopped tracking. She took a step to the left. The eyes tracked left. She took a step to the right. The eyes tracked right. She pointed at Denny. The eyes moved back to him and stayed there. Well, Adebio said, apparently it's waiting for him. Denny, to his credit, said that's fair. What happened over the next 6 hours was one of the strangest, most disorienting experiences I've ever had, and I've had some genuinely strange experiences. I spent 3 months on Karath Station during the supply shortage of 47, which is its own story, and I once accidentally started a diplomatic incident on Mir 7 involving a misunderstood hand gesture and a Velunian trade delegation. But those experiences had precedents. There were protocols. There were people who'd been through something similar and could tell you what to do next. Nobody had been through this. The statue continued to animate over the course of those 6 hours, not all at once. Gradually, like something warming up after a very, very long sleep. The hand it had raised eventually lowered. The light in its eyes dimmed and changed, cycling through colors the Xenotech team logged as potentially significant, blue, then amber, then something they couldn't quite name that fell between green and gold. A sound began to emanate from it, low and rhythmic, almost like breathing but not quite, more like a pattern, like something communicating in a register we didn't have instruments tuned to receive properly. And through all of it, it kept track of Denny. He'd sit down, 20 feet away, and it would orient slightly in his direction. He'd stand up, and it would do that same micro-adjustment. He'd walk to the supply tent, and the light in its eyes would follow him until he was out of its visual range. We'd established by now that the eyes had a range of about 40 degrees on each side, which meant it could track about a third of the site. And then when he came back, the light would brighten slightly, like it was, and this is the word Dr. Adebio used, and I think she was right, relieved. Like it didn't want to lose sight of him. This was, understandably, making Denny a little uncomfortable. "Can you make it stop?" he asked Adebio around hour 3. She looked up from her tablet. "Stop what?" "Looking at me." "No." "Can you even try?" "Marsh," Ochoa said from across the site without looking up, "you kissed it." "I'm aware of that, ma'am, thank you." "Then you live with the consequences." The consequences got significantly more complicated at hour 6, when the second transmission arrived. Not from the statue, from space. The relay station at the edge of the Voron system, a basic comms buoy we deployed when we arrived 4 months ago, mostly so we could file regular progress reports with the Colonial Survey Authority, picked up an incoming signal. Military band encrypted. Sector command. Ochoa took the transmission privately. She was with it for 11 minutes. When she came back out, her expression had changed in a way I noticed but couldn't immediately interpret. "We've got incoming," she said. "Survey team?" someone asked. "No," she paused. "Galactic Assembly Enforcement, Voth-class cruiser, ETA 4 hours." The camp went quiet in the way that camps go quiet when everyone simultaneously understands that the situation has escalated past the point where any of them are the most important people in it. Voth-class was Galactic Assembly. Gaen, we called them in the field Galactic Enforcement. The policing arm of the multi-species assembly that held nominal jurisdiction over about 60% of explored space, including this moon by treaty. They were, officially, our allies. Unofficially, their relationship with the Colonial Survey Authority, and specifically with human survey and military teams, was what diplomats called evolving, which was their way of saying increasingly hostile. The assembly had not been thrilled when the Voron 9 site was discovered. They'd filed 3 formal objections with the authority. The authority had cited the open excavation clauses of the Outer Systems Agreement and proceeded anyway. The assembly had not sent a ship then. They were sending one now. They picked up the statue's signal, Adebio said. She wasn't asking. She was looking at her readouts connecting something. Whatever resonance it started emitting when it activated, their sensors caught it. She looked up. They know. They know what? Tran asked. That it woke up. She looked at the statue, which was still doing that breathing pattern sound, still orienting itself toward Denny, its ancient eyes cycling through their slow parade of colors. And apparently, she said, that matters quite a bit to them. Chapter 3. The Ga'an Arrival. The ship arrived in 3 hours and 47 minutes, not 4 hours, which told us the ETA had been deliberately understated, which told us they didn't want us to have the full preparation time. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds paranoid, but you work in survey and military operations in contested outer systems long enough, you start reading the gaps between the information you're given and the information that would have been accurate. Those gaps are always intentional. It was a Voth-class cruiser, as advertised, long, gray-black, shaped like something between a hand and a blade. Ga'an ships always looked like that, designed for intimidation in a way that human military architecture wasn't, because human military architecture had been built, initially, by people who were still partially thinking about fighting other humans, and there were atmospheric and gravitational considerations that kept human ships looking more or less like things that could theoretically survive re-entry. Ga'an ships looked like they'd never needed to worry about a planet's atmosphere in their lives. It descended to about 1,000 meters above the plateau and held position. No landing, just presence. Just the weight of it hanging in the air above us, the ventral thrusters keeping it aloft with a sound like continuous distant thunder. Ochoa had the whole camp assembled, 31 people, survey team, science team, our small security detail of 12. She stood in front of us with her hands clasped behind her back, looking up at the ship, and then she turned and looked at us. Whatever happens in the next few hours, she said, we are a Colonial Survey Authority team on a legitimately authorized excavation under the Outer Systems Agreement. We have committed no treaty violations. We have done nothing wrong. She paused. Except Marsh, who kissed the artifact, but we're going to table that for now. There was a small, strained laugh from the assembled group. Even Denny managed half a smile. We are going to be professional, Ochoa continued. We are going to be calm. And we are going to let them say whatever they need to say and respond to it through proper channels. She looked specifically at Denny. Nobody is going to do anything impulsive. Ma'am, Denny said, I hear that and I want you to know I genuinely intend to comply. Good. But just for the record, kissing the statue wasn't impulsive so much as. Marsh. Yes, ma'am. The Ga'an delegation came down in a transport pod, 3 of them, which told us they weren't planning a full engagement, just a conversation, which was either reassuring or the most sophisticated form of intimidation, depending on how you looked at it. Voth species Ga'an troops wore environmental suits that made them look like they were encased in living shadow, black composite armor with subtle iridescent patterns, face masks that were reflective but not opaque, so you could almost see the face inside but not quite. They moved with a kind of deliberate, controlled precision that wasn't quite military in the human sense. Less march, more geometry, like each step was calculated to convey maximum authority at minimum energy expenditure. The commander was a Voth named Krensaraxis. We'd encounter that name in reports later, but in the moment we didn't know it. Just saw the slightly different insignia on the environmental suit that marked rank, and the way the other 2 positioned themselves slightly behind and to either side. Krensaraxis walked directly to Ochoa, stopped at exactly the right distance, close enough to be direct, far enough to not be aggressive. It was impressive, honestly. Everything about Ga'an command-level officers was impressive in a way that was designed to make you feel slightly outclassed. What they said, through the translator unit clipped to Ochoa's collar, was this. Lieutenant, this excavation site falls under Article 7 of the Galactic Heritage Preservation Accords, which supersedes the Outer Systems Agreement in matters pertaining to pre-contact civilizational artifacts. You have, through your team's actions, triggered an activation event in a Class 1 protected monument. Under the Heritage Accords, this constitutes a Class 3 unauthorized interference. You are required to cease all activity, surrender the activated artifact for assembly study, and submit your team for processing. Ochoa let that sit in the air for about 2 seconds. Then she said, "With respect, Commander, Article 7 applies to artifacts that have been formally designated and registered under the Accords. This site was discovered 4 months ago. It hasn't been registered under anything." Crensaraxis said, "It has now." Ochoa looked at them for a moment. "Just now." "As of 17 minutes ago, when the activation event was confirmed." Ochoa's jaw moved slightly. Not visibly to most people, but I'd known her for 2 years and I could see it. She was running calculations, legal calculations, the kind of calculations that involved the fact that the assembly had literally just, registered this site as heritage protected for the specific purpose of having jurisdiction over what we'd already done. It was, to put it simply, a political maneuver dressed up as law. "I'll need to consult with our legal channel," Ochoa said. "You have 6 hours, Crensaraxis said, "at which time, if you have not complied with the surrender requirement, we will be authorized to enforce." They left. The transport pod ascended. Above us, the cruiser continued to hang in the air like a gray-black moon that hated us. Ochoa turned around. She looked at Denny. "Marsh," she said. "Ma'am." "You kissed a 40,000-year-old alien statue." "Yes, ma'am. And now we have a gun warship over our heads and 6 hours to hand it over or get shot at." "When you put it like that," Denny said, "I feel like I should apologize." "Start thinking about how you're going to do more than apologize," she said. "Because that statue picked you for a reason, and I want to know what it is." Chapter 4: The Language of Old Things. Dr. Yumiko Adebio had been studying the statue for 4 months with nothing to show for it, except 7 pages of notes on its surface patterns, and a persistent headache that she suspected was related to the resonance field. In the 6 hours they had before the Gain deadline, she made more progress than she had in the previous 4 months combined. She said later that the statue wasn't being studied anymore. It was participating. Once it had activated, once Denny's spectacularly dumb kiss had apparently completed some kind of threshold condition that the thing had been waiting for, it began emitting information. Not in any language the translation matrices recognized, not at first, but in a way that was structured enough to be clearly intentional. The patterns on its surface shifted. The sounds changed in response to proximity and movement. The light from its eyes modulated in ways that Adebio's instruments could track, even if they couldn't interpret. She sat cross-legged on the ground in front of it, with 3 different scanner arrays running, and talked to it. Not in any language she thought it would understand. Just talked. The way you talk to something when you're trying to establish that you're not a threat, when you're trying to make contact across a gap so large it almost has no meaning. She talked about what the patterns on its surface looked like to her. She talked about the weather. She talked about her daughter, who was 12 years old and lived with her grandmother on Callisto Station and wanted to be an architect. The statue listened. The light in its eyes shifted toward Adebio, then back to Denny, who was sitting nearby watching all of this with his elbows on his knees. At one point, Adebio said, "I think it's waiting for him to do something else." Denny looked up. "Like what?" "I don't know, something it can recognize." She tilted her head. "What did you do exactly when you kissed it? I mean, what were you thinking?" Denny was quiet for a moment. "Honestly." "Please." "I was thinking about the gap in my teeth," he said, which wasn't what anyone expected. I was thinking this thing has been alone out here for however long, just standing here, and nobody ever treated it like anything except a mystery to be solved, like a puzzle box. And he paused. I was being dumb, but it wasn't mean. I wasn't making fun of it, I was just. He stopped. Adebio looked at the statue. The light in its eyes had shifted to that amber color, the warmest color it had shown so far. I was just being friendly, Denny said. That's all. The statue made a sound, then that none of the instruments had recorded before. Not a mechanical sound, not the resonance breathing, but something higher and clearer, almost musical. Almost, and I know how this sounds, almost like it was laughing. Adebio looked at her readouts. Her eyes went very wide. Denny, she said. Yeah. It's trying to communicate with you. Me specifically. You specifically. She turned the tablet toward him. The surface patterns on the statue were shifting in a rhythmic sequence, the same small cluster of patterns repeating and then extending, the way a word extends when a sentence is built around it. It's not using language as we understand it. It's using something older, something based in intention, in emotional state. She looked up. It responded to you because you approached it with genuine, uncomplicated goodwill. No agenda, no calculation, you just kissed it, Denny said. Yes, Adebio said, you just kissed it. What we pieced together over the next 3 hours, Adebio working her scanners, her linguistics assistant Yusuf doing real-time pattern analysis, Denny sitting in front of the statue, and occasionally talking to it the way you talk to someone you just met who didn't speak your language but seemed friendly, was a picture so old and so enormous that it took a while to hold. The Vorin were gone. Whatever species had built this, they were gone, and they'd been gone for so long that the concept of missing them had no frame of reference. The statue was theirs, not a monument, not a commemorative piece, but a messenger, a record. A last act of a civilization that had seen what was coming, some catastrophe, some end, and had decided that the most important thing they could do with their remaining time was build something that could wait. Something that could wait for whoever came next. The activation mechanism, what Denny's kiss had triggered, wasn't keyed to a specific biology or a specific language or a specific technology level. The theory Adebio developed rapidly, with the excitement of someone who has just watched history rewrite itself, was that it was keyed to intention, to a specific quality of approach. You couldn't activate it by studying it clinically, which explained why 4 months of careful, professional scientific study had produced nothing. You couldn't activate it by being awed by it, or afraid of it, or trying to extract value from it. You activated it by treating it, her word was casually, treating it with the easy, uncalculating warmth you'd show another person, not a mystery, not an artifact, a person. Which means, Yusuf said, looking up from his pattern analysis with a slightly stunned expression, that it's been waiting all this time for someone who wasn't trying. For someone like Denny, Adebio said. Everyone looked at Denny. Denny was eating a field ration bar and watching the statue, which was currently cycling through a slow, elaborate sequence of surface patterns that Yusuf was logging as fast as his instrument could record. He felt the eyes on him and looked around. What, he said. You might be the most important person in human history, Adebio said. Denny considered this for a moment. Is there extra pay for that? He asked. Chapter 5, 6 hours and counting. Ochoa had been on the comms with Colonial Survey Authority legal since Crensaraxis had delivered the ultimatum. Her expression had not improved. She joined the small group around the statue at the 90-minute mark, which meant she had 4.5 hours left, and the news she brought was exactly as useful as you'd expect from a legal consultation that had started with the phrase, "They registered it 17 minutes ago." The authorities' position, she said, is that the Heritage Preservation Accords can't apply retroactively to an activation event caused before the registration was filed. Good, someone said. The Assembly's position is that the Accords apply to the artifact itself, not the event, and that the artifact's heritage status predates human presence in this system by approximately 40,000 years. Less good, the same someone said. The authority is filing a counterpetition with the Assembly Judicial Council. She paused. The council's next scheduled session is in 11 months. Nobody said anything for a moment. So the legal route is not going to help us in the next 4.5 hours, Adebio said. Correct. And if we don't comply with their surrender order, they're authorized to enforce, which means the cruiser. More silence. Ochoa looked at the statue, at Adebio, at Denny. Tell me what we have, she said. Adebio told her. All of it, the theory of intention-based activation, the probability that the statue was a Voron messenger mechanism, the early-stage pattern analysis suggesting it was attempting to transmit information, the fact that it had specifically and consistently oriented itself toward Denny. Ochoa listened without interrupting, which was her way of listening when the information was important. When Adebio finished, Ochoa was quiet for a moment. The Ga'an want it surrendered for Assembly study, she said. Yes, because the Assembly knew what this was. Adebio stopped, something shifted in her expression. Say that again. They filed for heritage protection in 17 minutes. That's not a response time you get if you're seeing something for the first time. Ochoa's voice was very flat and very careful. They've known about this site, about this statue, about what it is and what it could do, and they've been watching, waiting to see if it would activate so they could claim jurisdiction the moment it did. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the previous ones. They didn't want it to activate, Tran said slowly. Or, Adebio said, and her voice had gone very quiet, they didn't want it to activate for us. What happened next I have gone over many times in my head, and I want to be careful about how I present it, because there's a version of this that sounds like heroism and a version that sounds like stupidity, and honestly, at the time, it was both. Ochoa gathered the security detail, 12 of us, plus herself, and laid out the situation in the simplest possible terms. The Ga'an were not coming to collect a scientific curiosity. They were coming to take control of a mechanism that had just been activated by a human for the first time in 40,000 years or more, for reasons they either didn't understand or understood too well. The surface patterns being decoded by Adebio's team were, in their early readings, consistent with a transmission of her word, inheritance, knowledge, legacy. Whatever the Voron had believed was worth preserving at the end of their civilization, they'd loaded it into this thing, and it had just decided to give it to us. The Ga'an knew that, and they wanted it. We have 31 people, Ochoa said. They have a Voth-class cruiser with a standard complement of 64 Ga'an enforcement troops. They can't use the cruiser's weapons on the site without risking the artifact they're trying to claim, but they can deploy ground forces, and they will. She looked at each of us in turn. I'm not asking anyone to fight a war. I'm asking you to hold a perimeter for approximately 3 more hours while the statue finishes whatever it started. After that, we take everything Adebio's team can record, and we get it out through the secure colonial relay. Whatever they do after that, whatever they take from us, they can't take what's already transmitted. She paused. This is your choice, all of you. Nobody left. I'd like to say that was because of some grand principle, some burning sense of humanity's right to its inheritance. And maybe for some of them it was. For me, honestly, it was simpler than that. I looked at Denny, sitting in front of that statue, talking to it like you'd talk to someone you just met at a rest stop, easy, warm, completely himself. And I thought about the fact that 40,000-year-old alien intelligence had looked at everything humanity had to offer and had picked Denny Marsh, of all people, and had decided that was enough. That felt like something worth protecting for 3 more hours. Chapter 6. The ground TEAMS come down. They deployed at the 2-hour mark. Not the 64-troop complement, not all of them. 16 in 4 assault pods coming down in a dispersed pattern to surround the site rather than breach it directly. Smart, patient. The behavior of a force that knows it has the numbers and the hardware and is in no particular hurry, just establishing the geometry of eventual compliance. Ochoa had our 12 arranged in a perimeter that wasn't trying to be a military defense. She was explicit about that. No weapons raised, no aggressive posturing, just presence. We were a survey team on an authorized excavation site, and we were going to stand here in an authorized survey team way until further notice. The Gaian ground team stopped at about 100 meters out, holding positions, watching. Krensaraxis came down in a separate pod, landed about 30 meters from our outer perimeter, walked forward to where Ochoa was standing and stopped. "You have 1 hour remaining on your compliance window," Krensaraxis said. "I'm aware," Ochoa said. "The activation event you triggered has initiated a sequence that will be irreversible after approximately 2.5 hours from initial activation," Krensaraxis said. "The Assembly has been monitoring this artifact for 60 years. The activation threshold was determined 22 years ago. What your team member did was not an accident of curiosity. It was the fulfillment of a known possibility that the Assembly has had protocols in place to prevent." There it was, out loud. I watched Ochoa process it. "You knew," she said. "We knew the conditions. And you had protocols to prevent it." "We have protocols to manage heritage artifacts," Krensaraxis said, which was technically a different thing, and they both knew it. "What's in the transmission?" Ochoa asked. "What does the sequence transmit?" Krensaraxis was quiet for a moment. The reflective face mask gave nothing away. "Navigation," they said finally. Ochoa looked at them. "Navigation," she repeated. "Coordinates. 47 specific locations in the galaxy, each one containing a deposit of the technology the Vorin developed in their final years. Physics, energy systems, communication arrays. What your scientists would call the equivalent of several thousand years of advancement compressed into viable, transferable information." Krensaraxis paused. "The Assembly has had 4 previous activation events, with 4 previous species, over the last 200 years. In each case, the artifact transmitted to species who were determined by its own criteria to be ready recipients." Ochoa was very still. "And what happened," she said, "in those 4 previous events?" Another pause. "The Assembly acquired the artifact before transmission was complete," Krensaraxis said. "In each case. I want you to understand what Serafina Ochoa did in the moment that followed, and why it matters. She did not reach for her weapon. She did not make a speech. She did not look at the cruiser hanging over us, or at the 16 Gaian troops at the perimeter, or at the legal and tactical impossibility of our situation. She looked at Krensaraxis and she said 4 times. Yes. 4 species, over 200 years. 4 times something 40,000 years old decided a civilization was ready for what it had to give, and 4 times you took it away." Krensaraxis said, "The stability of the galactic community requires management of." 4 times, Ochoa said again, not angry, just precise. "What did those 4 species do, the ones the artifact chose? What were they doing when it activated for them?" Krensaraxis did not answer. "Something simple," Ochoa said, "something uncalculating. Something that looked like kindness or joy or stupidity from the outside." She paused. "Because that's what this thing is looking for. That's its threshold. Not intelligence, not technology, just whatever it is that we call being human, even when it's not technically humans doing it." She turned around and looked at the site. At Denny, sitting in front of the statue, cross-legged now, the amber light from its eyes warm on his face, Adebio's instruments running beside him, Yusuf speaking rapidly into a recorder as the patterns continued to unfold. "We're not surrendering," she said, "and we're not fighting. We're just going to stay here for the time remaining and let it finish." "I will authorize enforcement," Krensaraxis said. "I know," Ochoa said. "And then this will be in front of the Assembly Judicial Council and the entire story will be on the record. What the artifact is, what it does, what the Assembly has done 4 times, what you were trying to do a 5th time." She looked at Krensaraxis. "How do you think that goes?" Chapter 7, The Last Hour. Krensaraxis returned to the perimeter. The troops held position. Nobody moved for about 40 minutes. Ochoa walked back to where Denny was sitting. She stood beside Adebio and watched the artifact's ongoing transmission. The patterns now elaborate and rapid, Yusuf barely keeping pace, his recorder running triple redundancy. "How much time?" she asked. 93 minutes remaining in the sequence," Adebio said. "We're about 60% through. We're transmitting everything in real time to the Colonial Secure Relay. Even if they take everything from us, all the hardware, everything on site, what's already transmitted is out of their reach." "Good." Ochoa crouched down beside Denny. "How are you doing?" Denny was watching the statue. The amber light from its eyes was warm and steady now, and the sound it was making, that breathing pattern sound, had changed into something almost melodic, like a language that was also music, like someone talking and humming at the same time. "I think it's saying goodbye," Denny said. Ochoa looked at the statue. "What makes you say that?" "I don't know, just the feeling of it." He was quiet for a moment. "For months this thing has been here, 40,000 years before that. And it finally gets to do what it was built to do." He glanced at Ochoa. "It's like, you know, when you've been carrying something for a really long time and you finally get to put it down." Ochoa didn't say anything. "It feels like that," Denny said. Krensaraxis deployed the ground teams at the 43-minute mark. Not aggressively. The 16 troops moved in from the perimeter, slow and deliberate, establishing a closer cordon. Our 12 positioned themselves, still no weapons raised, still just presence, and for a long moment the whole site had this strange, suspended quality, like a held breath. Denny stood up. I don't know if it was because he felt the change in energy, or because his knees were sore from sitting for so long, or because he just needed to stand. He stood up, turned and faced the approaching Ga'an troops, and he didn't reach for his sidearm, and he didn't take any kind of combat stance. He put his hands in his pockets. And then he started talking. Not to our team, not to Ochoa or me or Tran or anyone who knew him. He started talking to the Ga'an troops the way he'd talked to the statue, easy, warm, without any strategy behind it. "Hey," he said, "I know this is your job. I'm not going to pretend I don't know that. And I know whatever Krensaraxis told you is the information you've got, so I'm not going to argue that either." He paused. "I just want to say, and I know this is going to sound weird, whatever this thing has been carrying around for 40,000 years, it was meant to get somewhere. It was meant to matter. And it picked us. I don't know why. Probably because I'm an idiot who kisses alien statues, which honestly seems like the kind of reason a 40,000-year-old alien civilization would use if they'd thought carefully about what kind of species should get their technology." There was a pause. One of the Ga'an troops had stopped moving, then another. "I'm not asking you to let us go," Denny continued. "I'm just asking you to let it finish, whatever it's saying, whatever it's giving us." He looked at the statue, at the amber light, at the elaborate unfolding of patterns that Yusuf was recording with shaking hands. "It waited a really long time. That's gotta count for something, right?" Krensaraxis's voice came over the site comm at the 31-minute mark. "Stand down," they said. The troops held. "Stand down," Krensaraxis repeated. "Hold positions, do not advance." Ochoa looked at me, I looked at her, neither of us said anything. The troops held, did not advance. We all waited, in the red dust of Voron 9, with a Gaian warship hanging above us and 16 enforcement troops at a 100-meter perimeter. While an ancient alien messenger system finished the delivery, it had started 40,000 years ago and 5 minutes ago, both. Chapter 8, What the Statue Gave U.S. At the 31-minute mark, Adebio stood up very fast from her instruments and said, "Oh." Just that, just oh. I was close enough to see her screen, close enough to see what the readouts were showing. And even with my limited understanding of xenolinguistics and pattern transmission theory, I understood enough to know that what was coming through was structured, coherent, dense with information in a way that made the scanner arrays run hot, their processing cores working at capacity to log what was coming in. The 47 coordinate sets Krentz-Araxis had mentioned. Yes, but also, wrapped around them, layered through them like a frame around a picture, something else. Something Adebio would spend the next 3 years of her career working to decode, the first and most important thing she'd publish about it being a paper titled On the Ethics of Inheritance, in which she argued that the Voron hadn't just left behind technology. They'd left behind a reason. 40,000 years ago, maybe more, a civilization that had looked at the arc of their own story and understood it was ending had made a decision. Not to build a weapon, not to build a monument to their own greatness, not to attempt to survive. They decided to build a gift specifically designed to reach species that were still, and this was her word, translating the pattern concepts as accurately as she could, innocent. Not naive, not primitive, just not yet hardened. Not yet calculating their existence in purely strategic terms. They'd seen that hardening happen, she theorized. Seen it in their own history, maybe. Seen what species became when every interaction was a transaction, every gesture a negotiation. And they decided that what they wanted to give their inheritance to was something that could still walk up to a mystery and give it a kiss on the mouth, just because it felt like the right thing to do. The transmission contained, in compressed form, navigational data for 47 sites, the theoretical basis of 3 energy systems that our physics didn't have names for, 7 communication protocols that operated on principles our science hadn't discovered yet, and a message, an actual, translatable message, in a conceptual language that Adebio's team spent 6 months working out, and when they did, what it said was this. You will argue about whether you deserved this. Argue about that later. First, use it well. Denny was still standing, hands in his pockets, when the transmission completed. The statue's eyes dimmed. Not all the way out, they stayed lit, a low, steady blue like a pilot light. The surface pattern slowed. The sound it had been making faded to almost nothing and then found a steady, quiet note, lower and slower than before, and held it. The amber light was gone, the rapid cycling was gone, the urgency was gone. What remained felt, in a way I can't fully explain, like peace. Denny turned and looked at it. You good? He asked. The light in its eyes did something, a slow pulse once, like a nod. Denny nodded back. Good, yeah. He looked at it for another moment. Sorry it took us so long. Krentz-Araxis came back through the perimeter alone. Walked to Ochoa. Stood for a moment. The transmission is complete, Krentz-Araxis said. Yes, Ochoa said. The Assembly Judicial Council will be receiving our full report. So will the Colonial Survey Authority. They stood in the red dust, facing each other, and whatever had been in the air between them, the threat, the negotiation, the implicit pressure, had shifted into something less certain and less charged. The previous 4 events, Krentz-Araxis said after a pause, the species that were chosen, the ones we, another pause. What was transmitted to them in the portions we acquired, we studied it. For years, we were not able to make full use of it. The systems described in the transmission required foundational conceptual frameworks we did not possess. We had the information. We could not implement it. Achoa looked at them for a long moment. Because you didn't earn it, she said, not cruelly, just factually. Krensaraxis didn't respond to that. The coordinates will be shared, Achoa said. That's our position going into whatever comes next. Whatever is at those 47 sites, humanity doesn't keep that to itself. That's not who we are. She glanced at Denny, still standing by the statue, talking to it quietly, the gap-toothed grin back on his face. Or it's not who we're trying to be anyway. Chapter 9, After. What came after was political and complicated and took years to fully resolve. The Assembly filed 11 formal objections with the Judicial Council. The Colonial Survey Authority filed 8 counterpetitions. The Heritage Preservation Accords were amended 3 times in 2 years, with human advocates, specifically Dr. Adebyo, who became the unofficial voice of the Voron legacy, arguing for a framework that protected discovered sites without allowing preemptive jurisdictional claims on activation events. The 47 coordinate sites were explored over the following 8 years. 11 were on planets or moons claimed by Assembly member species. In those cases, humanity shared the navigational data and the theoretical frameworks, and the exploration was joint. 4 of them proved to be beyond the reach of any current technology. The remaining 32 yielded what Adebyo's initial transmission analysis had suggested: compressed archives of Voron knowledge that, when decoded, took physics and energy science and communication theory in directions that human researchers called, variously, revolutionary, disorienting, and the kind of thing that makes you feel like you've been reading books upside down your whole life. The 3 energy systems. 2 of them came online experimentally, theoretically, within 5 years. The third took 12 years, and when it did, the engineer who completed the theoretical framework cited in her published paper the phrase from the Voron message, "Use it well." She wrote, "I have tried." Krensaraxis filed their own report with the Assembly, which was not made public for 3 years. When it was, the part that human media focused on was a section titled Reassessment of Activation Event Response Protocol, in which Krensaraxis argued, against Assembly standing policy, that the previous 4 acquisitions had been, in their words, counterproductive to stated Assembly goals of galactic community stability. It was the closest thing to an admission that the Assembly had done something wrong that anyone had seen from a senior Gaian officer. It didn't go over well with the Assembly's senior committee. It went very well with the 4 species, whose activation events had been interrupted. There is now, in the outer chamber of the Assembly Judicial Council's main hall, a plaque with the Voron message on it, translated into 43 languages. It was put there after a vote in which humanity, the 4 previously interrupted species, and 17 Assembly member species who'd abstained from the original dispute all voted in favor. The Voth and 2 other core Assembly members voted against and were outvoted for the first time in the Assembly's recorded history. The plaque says, "You will argue about whether you deserved this. Argue about that later. First, use it well." The statue is still on Voron 9. They debated moving it. There were arguments for it: safety, accessibility, the symbolism of placing it somewhere central. There were arguments against, that moving it was exactly the kind of thing the Voron had built it not to be done to, that its meaning was partly in the fact of its stillness, its patience, its 40,000-year wait in the open air of that plateau. The against arguments won. The site is now a heritage designation that everyone agrees on, Assembly and Colonial Survey Authority both, a joint designation, the first of its kind. There's a small permanent research station there, and a viewing platform that members of any species can access under a permit system that was designed to be, in Adebyo's words, deliberately simple. The statue's eyes are still lit, that low, steady blue. It hasn't animated again, hasn't emitted further patterns, hasn't done anything except stand there in the way that it always stood there, with the curve of its mouth that looked like the expression someone makes when they know something you don't. Except now maybe it knows that we know, at least some of it. Denny Marsh got a commendation. He got several commendations, actually, once the full scope of what had happened was understood. He accepted them in the way he accepted most formal recognition, awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable in dress uniform, slightly fidgety, laughing at the wrong moments, and saying something Denny-ish that made the presenting officers unsure how to respond. He was promoted to sergeant. He remained, according to every commanding officer he subsequently served under, functionally brave and aggressively unserious, which he continued to treat as the highest praise available to him. He has a framed holograph on his wall now. Him and the statue. Someone on the site took it just before the Ghanaian troops held their position, right in the middle of everything, Denny standing in front of the statue, hands in his pockets, talking, the amber light from its eyes warm on his face, the sky of Vorin 9 a deep red-orange behind them. He says he looks at it sometimes when things are complicated. He says it reminds him that the universe is older than any problem he's ever going to have, and it's been waiting this whole time for someone to approach it without an agenda.